Something happened at Skinwalker Ranch that the team did not fully anticipate. In the most explosive operation the property has seen in years, researchers pushed further into one of its most persistent unknowns, a phenomenon known only as the bubble. What they walked away with was not confirmation. It was not closure. It was something stranger, a set of readings, reactions, and moments on camera that suggest the ranch may have responded back. For years, the bubble has sat at the edge of explanation, a localized anomaly that resists easy categorization, one that has quietly outlasted theory after theory. In heating up, the team decided to stop observing it from a distance and instead force a direct confrontation. They designed an operation aggressive enough to provoke a reaction. And now, in the aftermath, they are asking a question that should unsettle anyone watching. Was this a controlled experiment that simply produced expected results? Or did they trigger something the ranch was never meant to give up? What follows is a breakdown of the operation, the data, and the fracture it caused among the very researchers who designed it, a breakdown built from telemetry, on-site footage, and the reactions of a team that walked into this operation confident and walked out of it visibly shaken. Because by the end of this episode, one thing becomes clear. They may have gotten closer to the truth of the bubble than anyone ever has. And that truth may be more complicated and more troubling than they expected. Every instrument on that property was watching. Every camera was rolling. And somewhere in those hours of footage sits a moment the team is still struggling to fully explain. To understand why this operation matters, you have to understand what the bubble actually is, or at least, what researchers have been able to piece together about it so far. Across the show's run, the bubble has functioned less like a single event and more like a standing condition of the land itself. It is not a sighting. It is not a singular anomaly that appears and vanishes. It behaves more like a boundary, a region where instruments drift from baseline, where signals fluctuate without clear cause, and where environmental conditions shift in ways that resist conventional explanation. Researchers have measured it. They have mapped it. They have tried more than once to define its edges, and every time, it has proven difficult to pin down with any real precision. That inconsistency is part of what has made the bubble so difficult to investigate responsibly. A phenomenon that behaves the same way every time invites testing. A phenomenon that behaves differently every time invites obsession and, eventually, escalation. That escalation is exactly what brought the team to this point. Earlier operations treated the bubble cautiously, taking measurements, observing from a distance, careful not to disturb whatever equilibrium might exist within it. But caution, over time, produces diminishing returns. At some point, a team built on uncovering answers has to ask whether restraint is protecting the investigation or stalling it. Season after season, the pattern has repeated itself. A promising reading appears. The team moves in carefully. The anomaly settles back into ambiguity before any conclusive answer can be drawn. That cycle has shaped this team's thinking heading into this operation. There is a growing sense, unspoken but present in nearly every planning discussion, that the property will not simply hand over its answers to passive observation. If the truth is going to surface, it may have to be provoked into the open. That is the tension sitting underneath, heating up. This is not a routine check-in on a known anomaly. This is the moment the team decided that observation alone was no longer enough, and that if the bubble was ever going to reveal what it actually is, they were going to have to force the issue. What the audience believes about the bubble going into this episode is about to be tested, and so is the team. The operation at the center of heating up did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. It was designed, deliberately, and with a level of intensity the team has rarely applied to the bubble before. Referring to it as an explosive operation is not exaggeration for effect. This was a calculated escalation, built around applying direct pressure to the anomaly rather than simply observing its behavior from a safe distance. The logic behind it is straightforward, even if the execution is not. If the bubble responds to stimulus, then a controlled, high-intensity test should produce a measurable reaction, one clean enough to finally separate coincidence from cause. That logic is where the tension begins, because designing a test aggressive enough to provoke a response also means designing a test aggressive enough to risk consequences no one can fully predict. Inside the command team, the reasoning splits along familiar lines. Some argue that after years of inconclusive readings, a bolder approach is the only way forward, that half measures have kept the investigation circling the same unanswered questions season after season. Others are more measured, more concerned with what happens if the operation succeeds too well. If the bubble is capable of a reaction, what exactly are they preparing to be on the receiving end of? There are safety questions here that go beyond procedure. Equipment placement, personnel positioning, timing. Every element is treated with unusual seriousness because, unlike previous investigations, this one is not built around waiting for something to happen. It is built around making something happen. As the operation moves from planning into execution, the mood on site shifts. This is no longer routine fieldwork. This is the team stepping deliberately into the unknown, aware that whatever comes back may not be something they can fully control. Every piece of the operation is logged before it begins: equipment positioning, baseline readings, environmental conditions, personnel locations. This level of documentation isn't procedural formality. It's insurance built from the understanding that if something unusual does happen, the team will need an airtight record to distinguish genuine anomaly from simple equipment error. That distinction has undermined past investigations before, and no one on this team wants to relitigate old doubts. This time, they want the data to speak for itself. The first indication that something is different comes almost immediately. In the opening minutes after the operation begins, instrumentation across the site starts to shift. What would normally register as background noise, minor sensor irregularities, small baseline deviations, instead begins to form a pattern. Readings that should stabilize instead continue to climb. Numbers that should settle instead keep moving. On site, the tone changes just as quickly. What had been a controlled, procedural atmosphere shifts into something more alert, more focused. Voices grow quieter. Movements grow more deliberate. The kind of shift that happens when a team stops expecting a result and starts watching one unfold in real time. Camera operators catch it too, subtle environmental inconsistencies that are difficult to describe but unmistakable to notice. A shift in ambient light, a change in air pressure. Footage that, on review, doesn't quite match what anyone remembers experiencing live. None of it is dramatic in isolation. All of it, together, is enough to make experienced researchers stop and recheck their instruments. The central question forms almost immediately, and it does not go away for the rest of the episode. Is this coincidence? An artifact of pushing sensitive equipment past its normal operating limits, or is this an actual response? Evidence that the bubble is not a passive anomaly, but something capable of reacting to what is being done to it? No one on site is willing to answer that question yet. But the readings keep climbing, and so does the tension. What makes this moment different from past false starts is consistency. Sensor drift is common at Skinwalker Ranch, a known hazard of investigating a property already saturated with electromagnetic disturbance. But this deviation doesn't behave like typical drift. It doesn't spike and fade. It builds steadily in a way that suggests something ongoing rather than something momentary. On the monitoring station, one researcher flags the trend line and quietly calls for a second team to cross-check the readings against a separate, independent instrument cluster, a standard precaution, but one that carries more weight than usual given how the numbers are behaving. The independent check comes back consistent. Whatever is happening, it isn't isolated to a single faulty sensor. It's showing up across the board. If the first signal raised questions, what happens next raises them louder. As the operation continues, equipment across the site begins behaving erratically. Instruments that had been calibrated and tested extensively beforehand start returning inconsistent data. Some readings spike without explanation. Others drop out entirely, as though the connection between sensor and source has been severed mid-measurement. For a team that prides itself on rigorous, repeatable methodology, this kind of unexplained interference is more than an inconvenience. It's a signal in its own right. Longtime followers of the investigation will recognize the pattern immediately, even if the researchers on site are reluctant to say it out loud. Skinwalker Ranch has a documented history of technical disruption whenever investigations push too far, too fast, a kind of resistance that shows up right at the threshold of a breakthrough. Whether that pattern reflects something about the land itself, or simply the difficulty of running sensitive equipment in an environment already known for electromagnetic disturbance, remains an open question. But the timing, once again, is difficult to dismiss. On camera, the reactions are telling. Frustration gives way to something closer to unease. Technicians troubleshoot equipment that, by every normal standard, should be functioning correctly. Researchers exchange glances that communicate more than their words do. There's a shared, unspoken recognition moving through the team. This operation, which was supposed to be tightly controlled from start to finish, is beginning to slip outside of anyone's ability to fully manage it. That loss of control is the real turning point of this section, not just technically, but psychologically. The team designed this operation to apply pressure to the unknown. Now it's becoming clear that the pressure may be running in both directions. Attempts to isolate the source of the interference come up short. Cabling is checked. Power sources are checked. Redundant systems, brought specifically to guard against exactly this kind of failure, show the same irregular behavior as the primary equipment. There is no straightforward technical explanation on hand, only a growing list of ruled-out possibilities, and an uncomfortable silence where an answer should be. Back in the command center, the strain of the operation starts to show somewhere unexpected, among the researchers themselves. As the anomalous readings pile up and the equipment failures continue, the team splits into two distinct positions. One faction pushes to continue, arguing that this is precisely the kind of data they've spent years trying to capture, that's stopping now. In the middle of what may be the most significant response the bubble has ever produced, would mean walking away from the answer they've been chasing. The other faction is far more cautious, pointing to the unpredictability of the equipment failures as a warning sign rather than a data point, and questioning whether continuing the operation without understanding what's causing the interference is a risk worth taking. It's a disagreement that goes beyond simple methodology. It touches on something deeper: how much uncertainty a research team is willing to tolerate in pursuit of an answer, and at what point ambition starts to outweigh caution. The exchanges in the command center are tense, even restrained as they are. These are people who have worked together across seasons of investigation, and the disagreement here isn't about ego. It's about genuinely differing assessments of risk, built on years of first-hand experience with a property that has a track record of punishing complacency. This moment matters beyond the immediate operation. It marks a shift in how the team relates to the bubble itself, no longer as a passive subject of study, but as something that may be actively shaping the terms of the investigation. And that shift in perception is arguably as significant as anything the instruments have recorded so far. Eventually, a compromise is reached, though an uneasy one. The operation will continue, but under tightened restrictions, reduced exposure windows, closer monitoring, a lower threshold for pulling the plug entirely. It's a decision that satisfies no one completely, which in its own way is exactly what makes it feel like the right one. Once the immediate tension in the command center settles, the team turns to something more analytical: context. This is not the first time the bubble has produced unusual readings, and it is not the first time equipment has faltered at a critical moment during an investigation. Pulling from prior seasons, researchers begin laying this episode's data against historical records, comparing baseline deviations, timing of interference, and the conditions present during past anomalous events. What starts to emerge is not a single conclusive answer, but something arguably more compelling: a pattern. Certain triggers, certain types of operations, certain thresholds of applied pressure seem to correlate with the kind of reactive behavior the team is witnessing now. It's not proof of intent or awareness on the part of whatever the bubble represents, but it is evidence that the phenomenon may not be as random as it first appears. That distinction matters enormously to the investigation. A truly random anomaly resists prediction entirely. A structured one, however faint the structure, becomes something that can eventually be understood, modeled, and perhaps anticipated. If the team is right, and there is a discernible logic underlying the bubble's behavior, then this episode may represent more than an isolated incident. It may represent a data point in a much larger, still unfinished map. But the interpretations diverge here too. Some researchers see this pattern as evidence of a natural mechanism, some undiscovered environmental or geophysical process reacting predictably to specific conditions. Others are far less willing to rule out something more deliberate. The data on its own doesn't settle the argument. It only sharpens it. What everyone agrees on is that the historical comparison changes the stakes of the current operation. This is no longer being treated as an isolated event to be documented and filed away. It's being treated as the latest entry in a longer, still unfolding sequence, one that may finally be coherent enough to test predictively, rather than simply record after the fact. Then comes the moment the entire operation was built around. As the team compiles and reviews the full data set from the operation, one particular set of readings stands apart from everything else recorded that day. It isn't a single dramatic spike. It's something more unsettling, a sustained, structured deviation that holds steady for far longer than any prior baseline shift the team has documented. Where past anomalies have appeared and dissipated within moments, this one lingers, almost as if whatever is generating it is maintaining a deliberate state rather than reacting briefly and retreating. On the monitoring station, researchers replay the footage and telemetry frame by frame, trying to identify the exact moment the shift began, and more importantly, what precipitated it. The timing lines up almost precisely with the most aggressive phase of the operation, the point at which the team applied the greatest amount of direct pressure to the anomaly. That correlation is not proof, but in an investigation that has spent years searching for cause and effect, it is the closest thing to it they've ever recorded. This is the moment heating up earns its title. Whatever the bubble actually is, this data suggests it is not simply a passive environmental irregularity. It behaves, at least in this instance, like something capable of a sustained, proportional response to stimulus, a reaction, not just a fluctuation. For the team, this reframes everything. Years of cautious, incremental investigation have led to a single operation that may have produced the clearest signal yet that the bubble is not just present at Skinwalker Ranch. It may be responsive to it. The room goes quiet as this realization settles. No one rushes to declare a discovery. Everyone on that team has watched promising data evaporate under scrutiny before, and the instinct to remain skeptical of their own results is, if anything, sharper than their instinct to celebrate. But even accounting for that caution, several researchers admit on camera that they have never seen a data set quite like this one, not in scale, not in duration, and not in how closely it tracks against the operation's timeline. For now, the readings are secured, backed up, and flagged for further analysis. But the moment itself, the sustained deviation, captured in real time, correlated almost exactly with the operation's peak intensity, is already being treated as one of the most significant pieces of evidence the investigation has produced in years. With the central data point established, the conversation inevitably shifts toward interpretation, and here, the team's unity fully gives way to divergence. The more conservative explanations lean on known, if still poorly understood, geophysical processes. Some researchers propose that the sustained deviation could be linked to subsurface mineral composition interacting unpredictably with the equipment's electromagnetic output, an environmental inconsistency amplified by the specific conditions of the operation, rather than evidence of any active response. It's a grounded theory, consistent with prior instances of sensor irregularity tied to the property's unusual geology. Others are less convinced that geology alone accounts for the precision of the timing. If the anomaly were purely a passive material effect, they argue, the correlation with the operation's most aggressive phase should be far less exact than what the data shows. This opens the door to more unconventional theories, the possibility that the bubble represents some form of directed energy phenomenon, or even something suggesting an underlying intelligence or mechanism the team has yet to identify. Neither position is dismissed outright. That in itself says something about how far this investigation has come. The team is not entertaining wild speculation for its own sake. They're weighing competing interpretations against genuine data, none of which yet provides enough certainty to close the case in either direction. What remains consistent across every theory on the table is this: something in this operation moved beyond baseline expectation. The disagreement isn't about whether something unusual happened. It's about what that something actually is, and whether the ranch is capable of far more than anyone has been willing to say out loud. There's also a quieter, third position emerging among some on the team, one less concerned with naming a cause and more focused on what comes next. If the operation genuinely provoked a response, then the priority isn't necessarily explaining it immediately. It's determining whether it can be safely replicated, refined, and studied under even more controlled conditions. That question, more than any single theory, may end up shaping the direction of the investigation going forward. By the end of Heating Up, the team has more data than they've ever had on the bubble, and in many ways, more uncertainty than when they started. What's been confirmed is significant, a sustained, structured deviation, closely correlated with the most aggressive phase of a deliberately designed operation, paired with equipment interference consistent with the ranch's long-documented history of resistance at critical moments. What remains unconfirmed is just as significant, whether that response reflects a natural, if unusual, environmental process, or something closer to an active reaction from a phenomenon the team still cannot fully define. If anything, this episode raises more questions than it resolves. Is the bubble a fixed feature of the land, or something that adapts to the pressure applied to it? Was this operation a breakthrough, or simply the first time the team pushed hard enough to notice a threshold that's always been there? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if the ranch responded once under this level of pressure, what happens the next time someone pushes further? Those questions remain open. The team leaves this operation with data that will likely shape the direction of the investigation for seasons to come, and with a shared, unspoken understanding that they may have gotten closer to the truth than they are entirely comfortable with. The bubble, for now, keeps its secret. But for the first time, it's clear the ranch was listening. What happens next, whether the team pushes forward with an even more aggressive follow-up, or steps back to study what they've already captured, is a decision that will shape the next chapter of this investigation. Either way, Heating Up has changed the terms of the conversation. The bubble is no longer just a mystery to be measured from a distance. It may be a mystery capable of measuring them back.